We have been talking for weeks now, months, I guess, about the ideology that is taking over and making it difficult for people to say things other than what is becoming the dominant accepted truth on the street. And I've been talking about the "Don't Hurt Me" walls, and I read from Havel's essay on power of the powerlessness. I can't remember exactly what it was called. It had to do with power. His greengrocer example. And I've been reading of late this book called "Nothing to Envy: Ordinary Lives in North Korea" by Barbara Demick, which she's a journalist, now I think the bureau chief in Beijing for the LA Times, who spent a lot of time in South Korea and made several visits to North Korea, talking to people. Most of the people she talked to were people who had escaped from North Korea and were now in South Korea, and told her their personal stories. And one of the things that emerges from this book is just a reminder of the risk of compelled speech and its utility for us in seeing at the point that people are not feeling free to talk, that they are reporting that they feel self-censorship, or that they have to put a Black Lives Matter sign up in their window lest the activists come for them. We should be taking that as an indicator of worse things to come. That compelled speech is a kind of canary in a coal mine, and these signs in windows are a form of compelled speech, I'm arguing. So let me just do a very quick review of what Korea is, and then read a couple of short excerpts from this book. So the Korean Peninsula makes good geographic sense. I should have pulled up a map. I don't have one. But it's bounded by the Sea of Japan to the east and the Yellow Sea to the west, and a couple of rivers, the Yalu and the Tumen, apparently, probably mispronouncing those, at the land boundary with China to the north. But it's being split along the 38th parallel after World War II was an arbitrary political decision, arbitrary in terms of where it was. The end of World War II meant that there were two major forces in the world, and each of them were claiming some primacy over Korea, and that wasn't going to work. And so they were battling for it. But really, to the degree that there was a sort of natural, cultural, or linguistic, or tribal, or anything like that split, it would have been along, east and west. That basically people to the east were more likely gravitating to Japan, and people to the west to China, and there could have been a divide that way. But the split being put where it was effectively just cut a not homogeneous, but more homogeneous than many population in two, and the people in the south ended up with something like a democracy, and the people in the north ended up with what is probably the most totalitarian state in the world today. Not at the time, it took some time to get there. So Kim Il-sung, who ruled North Korea from its founding in 1948 until his death in 1994, then after when he died, his son Kim Jong-il became head of state. When Kim Il-sung died in 1994, the entire country became convulsed in grief and public displays of grief. And those two things, grief and public displays of grief, or public displays of something that appeared to be grief, were impossible to distinguish between. And that is the point of what I'm going to read from today. So this is, again, Nothing to Envy: Ordinary Lives in North Korea. This is journalistic and personal story-driven accounting of life in North Korea. So pages 98, 99, find them here. This is in the wake of the death of Kim Il-sung, the first head of state in North Korea. As a 21-year-old university student, Jun Song was naturally skeptical of all authority, including the North Korean government. He prided himself on his questioning intellect. But he didn't think of himself as seditious or in any way an enemy of the state. He believed in communism, or at least believed that whatever its faults, it was a more equitable and humane system than capitalism. He had imagined he would eventually join the Workers' Party and dedicate his life to the betterment of the fatherland. That was what was expected of all those who graduated from the top universities. Now, surrounded by sobbing students, Jun Song wondered, if everybody else felt such genuine love for Kim Il-sung and he did not, how would he possibly fit in? He had been contemplating his own reaction or lack thereof with an intellectual detachment, but suddenly he was gripped with fear. He was alone, completely alone in his indifference. He always thought he had close friends at the university, but now he realized he didn't know them at all. And certainly they didn't know him. If they did, he would be in trouble. This revelation was quickly followed by another, equally momentous. His entire future depended on his ability to cry. Not just his career and his membership in the Workers' Party, his very survival was at stake. It was a matter of life and death. Junsang was terrified. At first, he kept his head down so nobody could see his eyes. Then he figured out that if he kept his eyes open long enough, they would burn and tear up. It was like a staring contest. Stare, cry, stare, cry. Eventually, it became mechanical. The body took over where the mind left off, and suddenly he was really crying. He felt himself falling to his knees, rocking back and forth, sobbing just like everyone else. Nobody would be the wiser. And one more, unless you want to comment on that one.
Seems to speak for itself.
Yeah, exactly. A shorter excerpt here from page 101 of this book. What had started as a spontaneous outpouring of grief became a patriotic obligation. Women weren't supposed to wear makeup or do their hair during a 10-day mourning period. Drinking, dancing, and music were banned. The Inmanban kept track of how often people went to the statue to show their respect. Everybody was being watched. They not only scrutinized actions, but facial expressions and tone of voice, gauging them for sincerity. Miran had to go twice a day for the 10-day mourning period, once with the children from the kindergarten and once just with her work unit of teachers. She began to dread it, not just the grief, but the responsibility of making sure the fragile children didn't get trampled or work themselves into hysteria. There was one 5-year-old girl in her class who cried so loudly and was so demonstrative in her grief that Miran worried she would collapse. But then she noticed the girl was spitting in her hand to dampen her face with saliva. There were no actual tears. My mother told me if I don't cry, I'm a bad person, the girl confessed.
Wow.
So, North Korea is unique. We're not in North Korea. It is a particularly remarkable and extreme authoritarian, totalitarian, communist state. But the tactics that are used to get people to fall in line, to get them to comply, to cause them to act out of fear, and some people who act out of fear will at some point begin to believe the things that they say out of fear, just out of self-preservation, are familiar at this point. I would say that they're familiar to us increasingly, these tactics.
Yeah.
Not the outcome.
We are seeing the
tactics.
instinct to it, right? The degree to which we are compelled varies based on where you are, what industry you're in, and all of this. But we are seeing the instinct to compel people to feel even a particular way about things. We are seeing a rejection of the idea that you are free to formulate your own opinion about this, that, or the other.
Yeah.
And I do think there's a deep philosophical question here, which I feel I know the answer to, but I cannot defend it. The question is, are we justified? Certainly almost everybody who will be listening to this podcast will agree that there is something marvelous about being free. Now, I think we have to think carefully about what being free is, because it's very easy to take freedom and treat it frivolously, or basically to squander freedom. And should we be entitled to? My guess is we should be, that's part of freedom. But at some level, the ability to figure out in what to invest your freedom, right, and the values that will cause you to invest it in something good rather than to waste it, those things to me seem simply superior to a system that sustains life. It may even do some things better than a system in which you are free, because freedom involves freedom to fail, whereas a system that drives freedom out may be able to guarantee that at least that doesn't happen to you. But in any case, we are facing a question about whether or not, by what standard is the success of a system to be measured? Are we to be simply horrified by a system that compels you to cry in order to advertise your complete mental alignment with your population, even if that provides some kind of stability? I think so. But
I mean, also, I guess I would say the question that you ask is, are we to be simply horrified, as opposed to, perhaps the implied alternative was finding something good there. But one implied alternative that I heard was, or can we learn from it? Can we learn from it even though the outcome is not an outcome that any reasonable person would want? Can we learn from the tactics that we saw on the ground there and say, perhaps these are indicators of authoritarian movement that's afoot?